All right, what's going on, everyone? So, we're here on Web Dev Daily, which is a platform that I created, which provides you with UI challenges and also projects to practice your front end skills. So, for today's video, I thought we would attempt to solve or show you my solution for the weekly challenge, which this week is a select user role UI. And since I mainly stick to teaching Vue here on the channel, I thought this would be a great challenge to solve using Vue, as it does provide you a lot of opportunities to work with a lot of the fundamentals of Vue itself. So whether you're a beginner to Vue or you have some experience, this can be a great challenge to learn something new or just sharpen your Vue skills. Now, before we get started, if you do want to attempt this challenge on your own, then be sure to pause the video here and then head down below to the description where you can find a link to this challenge. Now, to start this challenge, you will need an account, which it is free to sign up for an account and very easy to do so. Now, once you're signed in or you create an account, what you'll want to do is, if you are a pro member, you do get access to a Figma design file, which will help you build more accurate solutions for all the challenges and projects here on Web Dev Daily. And if you're not a pro member, you can just download a PNG file of the design. Now, as I mentioned, we are going to be solving this challenge using Vue.js. However, if you do want to attempt to solve this challenge or any other challenge we have in Web Dev Daily with HTML, CSS, or JavaScript, we do have a built-in editor that will allow you to do this. So on each challenge dashboard, you'll see this button that says Solve an IDE, and this will take you to the IDE for that particular challenge. All right, so here inside of VS Code, let's get started. Now, the first thing we want to do is you want to install Vue. So what we can do is head over to vue.js.org and we can select on install. Then we want to copy the npm command. So we can just copy this, and then back inside of VS Code, we can open up the integrated terminal and we can just paste this command in like that. So for the name, we can just keep this as the default value of Vue project. That doesn't really matter too much. We are going to be using TypeScript, so we can select yes. We don't want any JSX. And since we are only going to be using a single page for this challenge, we don't need the Vue router, so we're going to select no. And then for everything else that we get in this prompt for creating our Vue project, we can just go ahead and select no. And once everything installs, we can run the command npm run dev to spin up our local development server. And now here inside of the browser, you can see we have our local development server running. Now, what we want to do is we want to get rid of a lot of the boilerplate that we get when we create a new Vue project. So what we can do is go through a couple things. So what we're going to do is remove the base and this CSS file so we can delete these. And then inside of the components folder, we can remove all these components. We don't need these. We just want to leave our app.vue file. And then here inside of our app.vue file, we want to clean this up so we can actually select all the content of this file and we can replace it with the empty Vue boilerplate. And lastly, we just want to head over to our main.ts file, and where we have this import for our main.css file, we just want to remove this as well. And with that, we should now have a nice clean slate to work on our challenge. So the next thing we want to do is for the styling, we are going to be opting to use Tailwind CSS. So we want to install that. So I'll leave a link down below in the description for the documentation on installing this if you want to head down there and copy some of these commands. So we already have our project created. So what we want to do is you want to run this command to install Tailwind and also create a Tailwind CSS config file inside of our Vue application. So let's again open up our terminal and we can just open up a new one like this, but we want to make sure we cd into our project. So we'll do cd view project like this, and we can just run that command like that. Now, once that is installed, you should see we have a Tailwind config file here inside of our project. So we just want to open this up. And then what we want to do is we want to head over to the documentation and we need to configure our template path. So what we can do is just copy this content property in the documentation and we can just paste it in here like this. And the last thing we need to do is add some of the Tailwind directives into our CSS. So what we can do is just copy these three like that. And then where we want to do this is within our assets folder. So we can just create a new file and we can just call this tailwind.css and we can just paste in these directives. And then inside of our main.ts, we just want to import this file. So right above our create app, we can just say import, and then we'll do /assets and then our tailwind.css file like that. And now we should have Tailwind installed into our Vue application. Now, really quickly before we continue, if you are interested in learning about a framework called Nuxt, which is a meta framework built on top of Vue, I am working on a new course called Learn Nuxt, which is currently available in early access. And in this course, we're going to dive into building modern applications with Nuxt, and the aim is to give you practical insights and a realistic approach to developing production-ready applications using Nuxt. So if you are interested in learning more about this, be sure to head over to learnnuxt.dev, which you can find a link to that down below in the description. And I'll also be providing you with an additional discount on top of early access for this video only, and you can find that code down below in the description as well. All right, so I went ahead and downloaded the Figma design for this challenge, and some of the benefits of having access to the Figma design is that you're going to get access to things like the font size, the font weight, spacing between elements, assets if there is any in that particular challenge that you can then download and use in your challenges very easily, as well as get access to all the colors that are used within that particular challenge. So now that we have Talon set up in our project, the next thing that we're going to do is configure some of these custom colors to be used inside of our Vue project. So what we want to do is head over to the Talon documentation, and there's a section here within customizing colors for generating your own colors. And what we can do is use a website called UI Colors, and this is a really great tool that will generate the same type of palette that all Talon colors come with. So what we can do is we can head back over to the Figma design, and we're not going to use all of these. So some of these are just different shades of the same color. So the first one we want to grab is this top one right here. So we can just copy this. And then back here on the generator, we can just select the text in the input and paste in our hex value. And then we can select on export. And we just want to copy this code right here with this button. And back here inside of our Vue project, we can open up our Talon configuration file, and we have a few different options of where we can paste this color value in. So if you just want to extend the default Talon color palette and you want to add on to it, then you would go inside of the extend property, and then you would define a colors property like this, and then you'd paste that value in. However, if you want to remove all the default Talon colors and only use your own, then what we can do is we can copy this colors property, and we can remove it from the extend, and then within the theme property, we can just paste it in here like that. And now, for example, here inside of our app.vue file, if we want to add a class such as a background color, you can see we only have access to the color that we define. However, if we remove that and we go back over to our Talon config and we take our colors property, and then we go back into the extend and we place it back here, and now we go back into our app, you should see we now have access to all the default Talon colors. However, we also have access to our new color that we added as well. Now, lately, my preference has to only have the colors that I'm using be available to me inside of my project. So with that being said, what I like to do is not have it inside of the extend property, but just have it live out here inside of our theme. Okay. So now that we have that, we also want to do this for another color that we have, which is going to be this like turquoise. So we can just copy here, and then we can just paste that value once again inside of our generator. We can select on export, copy this, and then beneath our first color, we can just paste it in here like that. Now for this challenge, we'll also need access to colors such as black and white. Now, since we went ahead and we removed all the default colors, if we went into our app.vue and we, for example, wanted to use the color white, say we did BG white, then we wouldn't have access to that class. So what we can do to fix this is we can actually import all the Talon colors into our config and pick which ones that we want. And the main reason why I like to do this is because it's going to reduce the number of class name and suggestions that we'll see within our Talon IntelliSense. So we didn't need to go ahead and remove all these, but it just makes things a little bit cleaner when you are writing out classes and the things are being provided to you inside of the Talon CSS IntelliSense. So what we can do is we can copy this colors variable that is being imported, and we can just paste that here inside of our file. And then what we can do inside of our colors property is we can define the colors that we want to have. So for example, we want the colors black and white. So what we can do is say white and then reference our colors variable. And then on here, we have the property called white. And then we can do the same thing for black. So then we can do black, and then we can say colors.black like this. And with that said, if we head back over to our app.vue, as you can see, we now have access to use that color of white. Now, if you were curious as to what colors you can configure with this colors variable, then what you can do is if you're on Mac, you can just command and click this to open up this file. And then there's another file that is being imported, which is this default colors type. And if we click on this, you can actually see all the different colors that you can then reference inside of your Talon configuration file if you wanted to clean up your IntelliSense and only use the colors that you're going to use in that particular project, or in our case, this challenge. All right, so now that we have things set up, let's begin to work on the markup for our challenge. So on this div, that's going to be wrapping everything. We want to start off by giving it a class of min h screen, which is going to set the height to be 100 VH. Then what we want to do is set the display to flex, and then we want to push all the items into the center. So we're going to say justify center, and we also want to say item center like this. And then we're going to set the background color to one of our custom colors or a shade of our custom color. So we can say BG, and then we want to say Alto, and then we want to use the shade of 50. Now inside of this div, we want to create another div. And what this is going to be for is if we head over to the Figma design, it's going to be for this thing right here. So let's go ahead and style up our div. So the first thing we want to do is set a max width on here. So we're going to use an arbitrary value, and we want the max width on this, essentially a card, to be 1200 pixels. And then we're also going to use a class of width full to set the width to be 100%. Now we want to add some padding to the top and bottom of this card. So we're going to say PY and then 24. And this is about 96 pixels of padding on the top and bottom. We also want to set the margin on the x-axis to be auto. Then we can set the display to be flex. Then we want the orientation to be a flex column. So we'll say flex column like this. We want to align all the items into the center. And we also want to add a little box shadow. So we're going to say shadow LG. And we also want to round the corners. So we'll say rounded XL. And then lastly, we just want to add a background color of white. And here inside of the browser, we should now have something that is starting to look like this. So the next thing we want to add is going to be some of our text here. So inside of this div, we can start to add that. So what we want to do is we can just add an H1. And then what we can do is we can just head over to the Figma design file. We can copy the contents. And beneath our H1, we can just have a paragraph tag for the rest of our text content. And we can grab that from the Figma file as well. So we can just copy this and then paste that in here like that. And then on the H1, what we want to do is apply a couple classes. So first off, we want to adjust the font size. So we use a class of text3XL, which is 30 pixels. If we hover over this, you can see what that class is doing with the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense plugin or extension for VS Code. And then we also want to apply some margin on the bottom. So we'll say MB6. And then on the paragraph tag, what we want to do is apply some margin on the bottom. So we'll say MB10. And we also want to change the font color to a shade of our custom color of Alto. And we can just say Alto 300. Now beneath our paragraph tag, we want to create another div. And this is going to house all the different types of roles, or I guess you want to call them cards, that we have inside of our challenge. So they're going to be these right here. Now we want this div to be a flex container, so we can give it the class of flex. And we also want to apply some spacing between each one of these items, and we can easily do that using a gap class, and we want to say gap 10. Now inside of this div, we want to create the markup for our cards. So each card is going to have a div, and then we can apply a couple classes. So we want to have some padding on the left and right, and we're going to use an arbitrary value, and we're going to say 60 pixels. And then we want to have some padding on the top, so let's say PT12. And we want to have some padding on the bottom, so we'll say PB14. Now each one of our cards are going to have a border, so we'll say border 2. And then the border color is going to be our custom color, so we'll say border Alto, and then we'll do 200. We want to have a border radius on these cards, so we'll say rounded XL, and we also want to put a cursor pointer. Now these cards are pretty simple. All they're going to have is an image and then some text, so we can first off define our image tag, and then we'll get to the source in a minute. And then we want to apply a couple classes, so we want to set a max width on here to be 150 pixels. And then we also want to set the width to be 100%, so we'll say width full. And beneath our image, we'll have a paragraph tag for the text, and then we want to apply a couple classes. So we'll have some margin on the top. We'll say MT4. We're going to increase the font size. We'll say text LG, and we want to align the text to the center. So we'll say text center like this. Now, I already went ahead and downloaded all the images from the Figma design, and I'm going to drag those here inside of the assets. Now, if you are following along and want to use these images, then you can just go to the link down below in the description, and there should be a link to the GitHub repo where you can find those here inside of the assets folder. So now that we have our images imported, let's define one of our images for our card. So the first one we're going to do is going to be for the UI UX designer. So we can say / and we can navigate to our assets folder. And then we have this image right here. And then for the text content of the first one, it's going to be UI/UX and then designer. Now, as you're able to see, I went ahead and spelled designer wrong because I am a terrible speller, but luckily I use a extension called Code Spell Checker, which will identify that I spelled it wrong, and it will offer a suggestion to fix it, just like if you're using something like Word. So what we can do is actually just click on this and a light bulb will appear here at the very left-hand side, and then we can do a quick fix and we can spell that correctly. And here inside of our browser, you can see we now have our card and then some of our text. However, if you look at the design, I think that text may be a little bit light. So what we can do is we can head up here and where we have a 300, let's do something like maybe 400. And I think that looks a little better. Maybe we can even try 500 like that. And that looks a lot better. All right, so now that we have the markup completed for our card, what we could do is select this and then duplicate it down 2 more times to give us 3 cards. And inside of the application, that looks great. And then what we could do is just change out the image to have the correct image for each one of our cards and then change out the text. However, this is not really a good way to handle this when using Vue. Now, the reason why this isn't a good way of handling it is because let's say, for example, on our card, we want to update some stuff like the padding. We want to say PT14, and then maybe we want to change the border to border 3. Well, now we have to go to each one of these cards and we have to make those same exact updates. Now, a better way that we can handle this would be to use what is called a v-for loop, and a v-for loop is going to iterate over an array, and for each item in that array can output a block of content such as our card here. So inside of our script, what we can do is we can create a new variable and we can just call this roles because essentially that is what this is. And then we can set this equal to a new ref, which is going to make our array reactive, and we can import that. And then inside of this ref, we can define an array, and then we want to have a couple different objects for the different roles that we're going to have inside of our challenge here. So what we can do is inside of each one of these objects, we can provide a title. So the first title is going to be UI/UX designer. The next role that we have is going to have a title of web developer. And for the last role, this is going to be a graphic designer. Now, what we also want to have a part of each one of our roles is going to be our image. Now, when we use Vue and we use a v-for loop, we just can't import the image as a path by saying ./assets like we do here inside of our source, inside of the template. We actually need to import these images here inside of our script tag. So what we can do is we can come up here, we can say import, and then we can do UI image like this. You want to give it a name. We can really name this whatever we want. We'll just say actually UI img, and then we want to say from, and then we want to navigate to our assets folder, and then we want to use this UI-UX image like this. And then what we can do is inside of our object here, we can just reference our image using this import like this. And then we want to do that for the additional 2 images. So we'll say import web dev image from, and then our assets once again, and then our web developer image. And then lastly, we'll have our graphic design. So we'll say graphic design image like this. And again, that'll be from our assets folder. And then we have our graphic designer image like this. And then what we want to do is copy this. And then we want to add our image property here like that. And then the same thing for the graphic designer. And now that we have this defined, what we can do is inside of this div that houses all of our cards, we can remove these additional 2 divs we created for our card. And then on the div for the card itself, we can use what is called a v-for loop. So we can define a v-for directive, and then we want to give it a param, which we'll just call role. And then we want to say in, and then we want to define our roles array. And without doing anything else and just having this v-for directive applied to this div, if we take a look inside of our application, you can now see we have 3 cards being outputted because inside of our roles array, we have 3 objects. So what we want to do next is make the content that lives inside of this div with the v-for directive dynamic, and how we can do that is by referencing this role param that we have defined here. And if we hover over it, you can see that each role contains a title and then an image. So what we can do is remove our source here like this, and then we can use a bind. So we can say colon, and then we can reference our role.image like this. And then inside of our paragraph text, we can just output the role.title. And if we save that, you can now see each one of these are going to have a different image and then also the correct title. Now we can take this a step further. We can also convert this into its own component. So what we can do is we can go to our components folder. We can create a new file, and we'll just call this roll card.view, and then we can scaffold out our view template. And then what we can do is just copy all of our markup for our card here inside of our app.view, and then we can paste it within the template here of our rolled card component. And then what we want to do is you want to remove this v4 directive, and we also want to remove the references of roll here from our image and then our title. So now the dynamic value of our image and our title are going to be passed in as props. So you need to define those inside of our script. So how we can do this is we can say define props. And inside of here, we can define our props. So the first one we're going to have is a title, and this will be a string. And then we also have our image, which will as well be a string. And now back here inside of our app.view file within our flex container for our cards, we can define our roll card component. And then we can auto import this like that. And then what we want to do is you want to apply our v4 directive to this component like this, and then we want to pass in those props. So the first one we have is going to be title, so we'll say title, and this will be equal to the role.title, and then we also have the image, which we can say, and we need to do a vbind here, and this will be role.image like this, and then we can remove our markup from beneath this component and save that. And here inside of our application, nothing has changed, but now we have encapsulated all that logic into our roll card component. Now in this design, we have some sort of pagination that is at the bottom beneath our roll card. And what I can assume this is probably for is something like a multi-step form. We are on step number 3 of 4. However, we're not going to be implementing that, but we will implement a static version of this within our challenge. So what we can do is inside of our project beneath our roll card container, we can create another div. And then what we can do is apply a couple classes. So we want to make this a flex container. And we want to apply some spacing, so we can use the gap class, and we'll say gap3. And then we also want to apply some margin on the top and bottom, so we'll say my10. Now for the static steps or the static pagination, we want to output 4 circles within our flex container here. And the easiest way to do this with writing very minimal markup would be to use a v4 directive. So let's define a div, and then we can define our v4 directive. Now, when you're using a v4 directive, you don't always have to iterate over an array. You can actually specify the amount of times you want something to just be repeated. So, for example, we want this to be outputted 4 times. We want 4 circles. So we can use a param. We can call this anything. I'll just call it n. And then we can say in, and then we can specify a number of times we want this to be repeated. So we want to do this 4 times. And then we can style up our circles. So what we want to do is we want to define a width. So we'll say W-2.5, and that's 10 pixels. And then we'll also do the height the same thing. We'll do 2-5. And then we want to round these fully. So we'll say rounded full. And we also want to give these a background color. And we're going to use our custom color of Alto. And then we're going to do 200 like this. So now if we save that and we take a look at our application, you can see now we have 4 of our circles being outputted. So as you can see in the Figma design, we want to have one of these steps be in an active state. So how we can set this up is on this div where we have the v4 directive, we can apply a dynamic class. So we can say class, and we can have our brackets, and then the class that we want to apply is going to be bg, and then we want to say turquoise, and then we'll do the value of 400. And we want to also make sure that this class is set to be important. And then what we want to do is you want to say colon and then provided a statement where we only want to have this class be applied. So in our case, you want this class to only be applied if this is the 3rd element inside of this iteration. So what we can do is we can say n, and if this is equal to 3. And as you can see now, we have that active state being applied to our 3rd element inside of our list. All right. Now, one thing that I realized we forgot to do when using the v4 directive is you want to apply a unique key to each one of our elements. So let's fix that really quick so we can do a colon key to bind. And then for this example on our pagination or the steps, we just want to make this key the n param. And then here on the roll cards, what we can do is, again, we'll do our colon key to bind this up. And then we can just use the role.title for this key. Okay, so the last UI item that we want to create is going to be this button we have at the bottom. So for this, just to get practice with Vue, we can just create a button component for this. So in our components folder, we can create a new file, and we'll just call this base button. And then within here, we can just scaffold out as normal our view template. Now, whenever I make a button, what I like to do is I like to have the ability to pass in a value for the button as a prop, but also get the flexibility to use a slot to pretty much add whatever content you want into your button. Maybe, for example, if you wanted to add an icon, you can have the ability to do that within the parent of where you use this component. So let's just start off by defining our props. So we'll say define props. And in here, we can just say label, and this will be a string. Now, inside of our template, let's create our button. And then let's go ahead and style this up. So the background color is going to be our turquoise color, and we're going to say 500. Now, whenever we hover over this, you want to lighten the background a little bit. So we'll say BG turquoise again, but this time we'll use a shade of 300. And to make this transition smooth, we can add a transition class, and we'll say duration 150, and then we'll add some padding on the top and bottom, so we'll say PY 2.5, and then we'll have some padding on the left and right, and we'll say PX 10. And then we'll increase the font size to be a little bit larger than normal, so we'll say text LG, and we want to round the corners on this, and then we also want to bold the font, so we'll say font medium. And then inside of this button, as I mentioned, what I like to do is get the flexibility to either use the label prop or use a slot to kind of customize the button. So what we can do is pass in our slot like this. And then by default, if we don't pass a slot, then we can just use the label like this. All right. And then back inside of our app.view file, let's use this button component. So we'll go right beneath our pagination and we'll say base button like this. And just to show you the flexibility of how this works, we can just define our label prop, and then we can just say next. And if we save that, we should see our button, which is actually over here. So it looks like we put this outside of our card. So let's move that up. And then you can see that's within here now. Now, if we wanted to use a slot, what we can do is give this a closing base button tag. And within here, since we just define this as a default slot, we can pass whatever sort of markup we want. So for example, if you wanted to add an icon with your button or anything like that, you can do that within here. But for this example, let's just add a paragraph tag and say hello like this. So now that we have this, our prop will be overridden with the default slot content. So we should now see hello within our button. All right, so in this design, as you can see, we have an active state for our roll card. So what we're going to do is whenever we click on one of our cards, it's going to set it into an active state. Now, to achieve this, what we need to do is track whatever card is currently active. So what we're going to do is inside each one of our objects within our roles array, we want to add an active property. And by default, we'll just set this to false, and we want to add this to all of them. And on our roll card component, we just want to pass this new property as a prop. So we haven't created the prop in our component, but we'll call this active. So we'll say active, and then we'll set this equal to our role, and then our property of active. And here inside of our roll card component, we just want to define this prop. So we'll say active, and this will be the type of Boolean. And what we want to do is whenever this active property or prop is true, we just want to apply a couple classes. So first off, we'll just apply a dynamic class to our card itself. So we'll say :class. And then first off, we just want to change the border color. So we'll say border turquoise and then 500. And we also want to add a shadow. And then we only want to apply this class if our active prop is true. Now, what we also want to do is update our text color. So again, we'll say :class. And then here we can just say text and then turquoise 500. And then again, only want to apply this class if our active prop is true. And now if we update one of our active properties to true and we take a look inside of our application, you can now see we have an active state. However, what we want to do is whenever we click on one of our cards, we want to set them into that active state. Now to do this, what we can do is create a new function, and then we can just call this select role. And this will accept a index as a param, which will be the type of number. Now, whenever we run this function, what we first want to do is we want to ensure that all of our roles are set to false. So what we can say is roles, and then to actually reference this inside of our script, we need to say value. And then we can use a method called forEach, which will just cycle through all of our array items. And this accepts a callback. And then what we want to do is give it a param of role. And then what we want to do is reference our role param. And then we want to reference our active property. And we want to set all these to false. And then what we want to do is set the role that was currently selected to true. So how we can do this, we can say roles.value once again, and we can reference that specific role that was selected by referencing the index that is going to get passed when we call this function. And then we can set the active property to true. And then here on our role card component, what we can do is we can say @ and then we can listen for a click on here. And then whenever we click, we want to then run our function of select role. Now, we want to pass an index, and how we can do that is we can pass a second param when we call our v4 directive or v4 loop, and we can just reference that index. And then whenever we call this function, we can just pass that inside of this function. And now when we select on one of our cards, you can see they go into an active state. And if we select on a different one, then that one goes into an active state and this one gets set back to inactive. Now, one thing that we could improve with this is currently if we select on a role card that is already active, it stays active. So what we could do is if we click on the role card again that is already active, then we can just set that to be inactive. So first off, what we're going to do is we're going to store the current selected role inside of a variable called role. So again, we can say roles.value, and then we can reference that index that gets passed to reference the current selected role. And what we want to do is use a if condition. And what we want to say in here is if the current role is already active, then what we want to do is just set that to be inactive. So we'll say role.active is equal to false. And to ensure that this logic beneath this doesn't run, what we can do is just return out of the function. And because we're now storing our role inside of a variable, what we can also do is clean this up down here by just referencing this as role. And now as you can see, if we go ahead and select on a role and we click on it again, that it's going to set it back to an inactive state. Now to take our challenge a step further, what we could also do is disable this next button until a user has selected on one of these roles. Because in a real multi-step form, we wouldn't want the user to continue on to the next step until they have selected one of these roles. Now, to implement something like this, we need to be able to detect that one of these properties of active is set to true inside of a roles array. And to do this, we can use a computed property to check this. So what we can do is create a new variable, and we'll call this is role selected. And then we can set this equal to our computed property. And inside here, what we can do is say return because we want to return this value, which we're going to be defining. And then we want to reference our roles array. And what we're going to do is use a method called sum. And what this method does is it's going to iterate over our array, and it's going to check whatever condition we set up to make sure that one of our array items matches that condition. So we can pass it a callback. And then we can define our param, which is going to be role. And what we want to check for is that one of our roles has an active property, and that is true. And just to show you how this works, we can select our variable, and then what we can do is beneath or above our button, we can just output this value. And if we save that and we head over, as you can see right now, we don't have anything selected, so this value is currently false. However, if we select on one, then you can see it is now true. And what we want to do is pass this value as a prop to our button. So what we can do is create a new prop, and we'll call this disabled. And we can set this prop to our isRoleSelected. However, we only want the disable to be true if this is actually false. So what we can do is in front of this, we can just pass an exclamation point. And on our base button component, what we want to do is you want to define that disabled prop, and this will be the type of Boolean. And then on the button, we want to bind the disabled attribute to our disabled prop. And then on the button, what we can do to style this up a little bit differently is we can use the disabled modifier from Tailwind, and we can update our background color to our custom color of Alto and then the shade of 400. And now here inside of our component, as you can see by default, when we don't have a role selected, our button is disabled, but as soon as we select on a role, our button is now active. Alright, so one final thing that we're going to do that I forgot when we started this project was to update the font for the challenge itself. So this font is going to use the font family of Poppin. So here on Google Fonts, what we can do is we can use the import statement, and we can copy this, and then we can head back over to our project. And there may be better ways to handle this or where to put this, but in our case, since it's just a little challenge, we can include this import statement within our tailwind.css file, and we can just remove these style tags like this. We don't need that. And to set this font up to be used with Tailwind, what we want to do is navigate over to the Tailwind config file. And then within our theme, we want to define a property called font family. And inside here, we just want to define the property of our font name. So this is going to be called Poppins because that's the font family we're using. And then we can just set this equal to an array, which is then going to contain our font family of Poppins and then a backup of sans serif. And then back here inside of wrap.view, what we can do is on this div that is wrapping everything, we can apply this class by saying font and then Poppins like this. And if we save that now, we should see that our font family has been updated to Poppins. Alright, so now that our challenge is completed, I went ahead and deployed it over on Vercel. Now, if you are interested in learning how to deploy your Vue or Nuxt applications here on Vercel, I've already created a few videos on how to do this, and I'll leave links to those down below in the description. Now, one mistake that I wanted to mention that I had to correct was we actually don't have the availability to use require here inside of our Tailwind config file, so instead what you want to do is actually just update this to be an import. So now that we have our application deployed over on Vercel and we have it linked up to GitHub repo, we can now submit our solution here on Web Dev Daily. So what we want to do is on the challenge dashboard, we just want to click on submit. So what we want to do is grab our repository URL, our live challenge URL, and also our description. So we can grab our GitHub repo. So we can just copy this and then we can paste that in here. And then on Vercel, we can just copy this as well. And we can paste that in here like that. And then we can just provide a brief description. And once you submit that, it's going to take a screenshot of your challenge, and then it's going to use that as a thumbnail. And then as you can see on the bottom here, you can also share this to get some likes. You'll have a link to your repository and also a link to the demo. Alright, so that is going to wrap it up here for this video. If you did enjoy it, be sure to leave a like on it down below and subscribe if you're new for more content like this. And be sure to head over and check out Web Dev Daily. It is free to sign up, and we have new challenges that get added every week. But anyways, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.